Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
New technologies and new threats are forcing agencies to make decisions faster than they once did. That reality is raising questions about whether federal acquisition processes are keeping pace. Stephanie Kostro, president of the Professional Services Council, joins me to talk through the challenge. And Stephanie, first things first, let's kind of just go with the big picture here as we are talking AI, cybersecurity, and there's still a lot at play. You know, with emerging technologies like this, there seems to be almost the pressure is on for the government to speed up the acquisition process as much as possible just because things are changing so fast. But that's kind of hard to do because things are changing so fast. So what's your read on all this going on right now?
So let's tackle AI first, Eric, if you want. So the General Services Administration put out a draft clause for terms and conditions, which I know sounds super sexy to your listeners, but it's really important for government contractors to understand what they'll contractually be obligated to comply with. And they put out a draft clause back in March of this year that had some real problems for industry, talking about control of intellectual property, having a really broad scope, et cetera. So we submitted comments to Professional Services Council on that initial draft clause back in the day, and they put out a new one, and comments were due yesterday, August 3rd. And so we obviously read it with great interest, as did all of our industry members. And we were very, very relieved to see that from an artificial intelligence perspective, this new draft clause was light years better than what had been circulated in March. So to me, that means the government is listening. Yes, the pace of change is really fast in this area, but they're listening to industry feedback. And in fact, in support of this latest request for comments, GSA hosted a listening session back in mid-July, and you could really, really tell that they were open to constructive critique. And so I'm very hopeful that this, when it goes final, will be a really, really good clause to have in contracts.
Yeah, part of the issue with any new technology policy is finding that balance between, encouraging innovation and also managing the risk. Where can the government still kind of right that balance when it comes to AI acquisition? You sound like you're impressed with this latest clause coming out, but I imagine that there's room for improvement since there always is, right?
Yeah, there is. And actually, if I could talk briefly about the improvements that they made, which were they narrowed the license grant just to the federal government. They talked about contractors retaining ownership of underlying large language models and base models, et cetera. And instead of having a limitation on everything needing to be developed and produced in the United States, there's now a preference for that. That said, we do still find the scope of this clause a bit broad. And I'll give you a real world example, Eric, which is to say, for anyone using Microsoft Word or any of those products, you're very familiar with the grammar checker function, right? Of good Lord, make my writing better. And so that is actually artificial intelligence. That is not excluded in this clause. And so everyday uses of AI are not excluded in this clause, and therefore it makes the compliance burden pretty tough. And so we are recommending that they look at the scope of the definition and really tailor it to real world applications and issues where they may find problems with contractor use of AI. In addition, the flow down requirements of all subcontractors needing to comply with particular elements is a problem as well, because you might have privity of contract with your first tier subs, but beyond that you don't. And then how does that play in actuality? And so I think flow down, narrowing the scope, et cetera. And then finally, I mentioned it earlier, Eric, and this is always an issue with the government and contractors, intellectual property. Who has rights to the data, who has rights to use the data to analyze it and then to promulgate it. And so that, I think, is another topic that needs to be tackled.
Speaking here with Professional Services Council President Stephanie Kostro, and the pressure is not unfounded, right? I mean, the cyber attack on Minnesota community water systems is just a reminder that the threats aren't going to wait for the government to figure out how it needs to buy this technology. And in fact, that same technology may be being utilized to attack government services. Is that one of the other big challenges in finding that right solution or getting the pace fast enough to keep up with everything?
I think that's absolutely right, Eric. And so let's talk a little bit about that cyber attack in it's at least 7 states. Minnesota was the one we've heard a lot about, but it's in places like Michigan and elsewhere too. And then it is a cyber attack that, we had been warned that things that were exposed to the public, the internet, et cetera, that things like programmable logic controllers, et cetera, that are used to remotely monitor and control water systems, they were exposed. And so the fact that there was a cyber attack, while terrible, not completely a surprise. Think about the water situation in terms of how people manage their water. It's very dispersed, right? So sometimes you have local municipalities managing water. Sometimes you have counties. Sometimes you have other municipal elements. Sometimes you have private ownership. So you have a really broad ownership structure of water supplies. And that, of course, creates risk and vulnerabilities. It's really hard to rally that community together to agree on common standards. And I think that is something that we need to do. CISA, which is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency over at the Department of Homeland Security, as well as the FBI and the Environmental Protection Agency, all have issued warnings about targeting internet-exposed industry controllers, etc. This is a really important infrastructure issue to tackle. And of course, it is layered with the fact that we are looking at another continuing resolution to start fiscal year 27. EPA and CISA, that agency at DHS I just referenced, are seeing some cuts in critical areas. And we really do need to talk about how they can leverage the strength of contractors to actually address some of these vulnerabilities.
Yeah, it's not unique to AI, right? I mean, when it comes to cybersecurity, certainly things do move a little faster. But, when agencies decide that they need new cybersecurity tools or defenses or new defense technology overall, where do contractors see the most friction in the acquisition process? I mean, what tends to slow things down when everybody knows that speed is the key, all parties involved, but even still, there are some barriers. What are they?
So those barriers include things like the acquisition tools that DHS has at its disposal. We talk a lot about other transaction authority in the context of the Department of War or the Department of Defense, but DHS used to have OT authority as well. And that is something where you can quickly get a contractor under contract to start developing and prototyping, groundbreaking technologies, really ahead of the curve emerging technologies. And DHS lost that authority a few years ago. I would love to see them get that back so that they could put really eager private sector intelligence and skill sets under contract to address these vulnerabilities before they actually become threatened.
And in looking ahead, what would tell you that some of those, I won't call them complaints, but light suggestions are being heard and that federal acquisition is becoming more responsive to emerging technologies and cyber threats that we're seeing today without, sacrificing the accountability and making sure that the taxpayers are getting what they pay for?
So it's funny that you mentioned at the outset of this talk here, Eric, about things getting a little bit messy, right? So we have something obviously going on right now, the Revolutionary FAR overhaul, and that is in part to help streamline acquisition processes, to ease compliance burdens, to get better, faster, stronger capabilities into the hands of the government users, right? Things like innovation, leveraging non-traditional partners, et cetera, are all really good examples of ways that we could move faster if we just get out of our own ways. And so we are in that messy middle right now, Eric, where we have legacy FAR clauses in existing contracts. We have class deviations that were issued last year that are in contracts, and now we have new FAR clauses coming out to put into contracts. It is a really, really difficult time to be a government contractor right now to sift through all of that. But I do have hope that there is light at the end of this particular tunnel, that we can start fielding these technologies. And again, as I said earlier, get out of our own way.
And I've garnered the relief kind of from you that it seems as if administration officials are listening. I mean, you talked about the GSA listening session and they're ripe for feedback. And it seems as if they are on board with hearing what you all have to say, right?
They do seem that way. And I do think they're taking those comments that we submit pretty seriously. We had 4 proposed rules come out in the FAR overhaul a while ago. Comments were due just a couple of weeks ago. We anticipate seeing new proposed rules for other elements of the FAR coming out. They're taking our comment seriously, particularly on things like market research, the role of small business in introducing and developing innovations, et cetera. So I really do have hope that we are going to be, as I said earlier, better, faster, stronger in the technologies and capabilities that we can wield.
Stephanie Kostro is president of the Professional Services Council. Stephanie, thank you as always.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.